Hi, this is the Social Jello with Angelo show. My name's Angelo. I'm a social scientist, surfer, martial artist, and a whole lot of other things. Coming to you live from Kasai City, Japan, the Social Jello with Angelo show.
Hey, what's up, everyone? I'm here with Anthony Miele, Kajukenbo instructor. As you saw the title of this podcast, it's going to be about beating the dead horse part 2. Part 1 of this podcast was done with John Hoylo and David Fulvio and, oh boy, bro. I called him bro because I couldn't pronounce his name right. Ryan Fujiwara, pro wrestler and Aikido practitioner out in Japan. If you want to check that out, check out my Facebook page, or check out the Kajukenbo family tree, Kajukenbo Training Society. I posted it on all those places on YouTube. It's not my channel. It's my friend's channel that we did that podcast on, where we went over the good, the bad, and the ugly of Aikido. But we're bringing it into a part 2 of this series. But before we get started, Anthony, share with us your martial arts journey. How did you get into Kajukenbo?
Thank you for having me on. I got into I started martial arts in 1983 when I went to college. I started training with my teacher, Robert Dutilli. At the time, Dutilli, Grandmaster Dutilli, he trained with a guy named Kale Kano Griffin, who's now, rest in peace, passed on. And at the time, we weren't affiliated with Kajukenbo. So I trained while in college for 4 years. And then during the summers, I would go full time and train at Master Griffin's studio with a lot of the first generation black belts in the Springfield, Massachusetts area. And then after I graduated college, I moved to Washington, D.C. You might have noticed that my name, my school name, and my fighting name is Lone Wolf.
Oh, yeah.
You might identify with this because I was away. I was in Washington, D.C. Everybody else was training back in Springfield, and I was by myself. So while I was in Washington, D.C., I started studying other arts. So I got into a version of Aikido, which was from the Tohei branch, the Ki Aikido branch. But this is back in the early 90s. And I did that. I did a form of Kung Fu, a Shaolin Hung Fut, with a guy from Hong Kong that was the one who inherited the leadership of that. And then I did some Taekwondo, which is really big in the DC area, and some Tang Sudo. But there was something really interesting about how the Aikido instructors taught Aikido back at that time. And I was really young. I was really aggressive with the Kempo Kaju background. So I had a tough time kind of calming down and softening what I did, but it was good. And then I eventually came back to Massachusetts and got more involved with Kajukenbo. And eventually we started working a lot with Senior Grandmaster Rick Kinji and his family and his Ohana. And now we're full under the Kinji Ohana and style of Kajukenbo.
And then for those of you listening,
Grandmaster Dutilli.
Kinji, the Kinji Ohana is based out of Southern California. Mm-hmm. And that's related to my Ohana. We keep saying Ohana for those of you who don't know what Kajukenbo. Ohana means family in Hawaiian. So like there's a lot of different branches of Kajukenbo, and sometimes we all get together, sometimes we don't really know each other because we're worlds apart. But in this case, actually, Anthony's Ohana is directly related because my instructor is Professor, I guess if I got the title right, Ronnie Sagiri, and he's coming out of San Diego, California. So they've gone down to I think they're like in the LA area, right? So yep. They've gone down to LA and done some cross training and stuff. So yeah, I personally haven't been able to train with Kinji because I was out in Japan by the time all that stuff was happening. But Yeah, there's definitely a connection there.
Right. So I can relate to you being away from home base.
Yeah.
And even now I'm in Boston. So most of the guys I train with in Kaju are about an hour and a half away from me, which is, it's not like Japan versus the States, but it's not as bad as it was when I was in DC. But since I've been back here in the Boston area, I came back in 2002. I got significantly involved for a while in training with the Aikido in the Boston area. And there's a specific flavor to that, which is a little different than what the guys that you had the podcast the other day with were talking about, because they're in the main branch. But because of the Boston flavor, there's a guy that Kanai Sensei was the guy that these guys trained under. And Kanai Sensei was a kid, like a young guy that was getting in trouble, and he lived with Ushiba. And he would get into street fights every week.
And that was in so Kanai Sensei.
Well, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't exaggerate, but I've heard stories, and he was living with Ushiba, and he would actually end up getting in altercations and having issues. And then he ended up eventually coming to the Boston area, and was just such a huge influence on some of the guys that I trained with for a while.
Huh. All right, I'm gonna pause you real quick to let in. So, Kanai Sensei was this was already after you came back from the DC area in Boston?
Right, and I never trained with him directly. I trained with some guys who learned from him personally in the Framingham, Massachusetts area. So I learned a lot from them, and they told me a lot about Kanai Sensei. They just told me all kinds of he had a huge influence on them and a big influence on Aikido in the Boston area.
And then you also said by the time you came into the DC area to do Aikido, you already had were you already doing Kaju at that point?
I was at that point I was a black belt in Kempo and by then we had some influences from a guy named Daniel Kane Pai, who's a guy from Hawaii, and he's got some relationships with Ed Parker and some of the other Kempo and Kajukenbo people. And he was active in the New England area, I think in the Hartford area. And Kale Kano Griffin studied under Ed Parker, and then under Daniel Kane Pai. Also, he studied Durban Goju, some other stuff. And then by the time I moved to DC, we were wearing the Ed Parker patch. Okay. And when Ed Parker died, Grandmaster Griffin reaffiliated with Adriano Imperato while he was still alive, and that's how we got brought back into the Kajukenbo family. And that's when my teacher Robert Dutilli was very involved with Kajukenbo while I was away in DC, Washington DC. And then I came back for a seminar. I think it was 2001. I came back for a seminar in Springfield. I met Adriano Cijo Imperato. He actually spent some time showing me some stuff. And I met with a bunch of black belts, including the guy up in Montreal, some of the other black belts. It was great. It was a great experience. So that's how I kind of started getting into the fold. And then by the late, before I think 2009, I think that's when we were working a lot with the Kinjis.
Okay.
But in the middle of all this, I had the benefit of having some judo training with Robert Dutilli under Master Griffin, and then having the Aikido influences when I was in DC as well as in Boston, which totally different flavors, but really I thought helped me put it into context. So I have some different perspectives just because of the way I came at it. I didn't start at Aikido first.
And when you got into Aikido in the DC area, What
Mm-hmm.
were they doing? Were they sparring?
Well, that's the thing. The thing about Aikido. All right. Well, so they don't spar, but I think a fair way of putting Aikido is I think a more fair way of putting what you do when you're on Aikido is you're doing drills. So John Hackelman will call them drills. He loves drills. He's a big fan of doing drills. You don't have to hurt each other in order to learn. That's what you do in Aikido. The problem with Aikido is that some practitioners in Aikido don't understand the practical limitations of what they're doing, or they may understand it because some of these guys are black belts in other styles, and some of them do kendo, so they do weapons, and they're really good. They don't explain why they're doing what they're doing. So as a student, you don't always fully understand what you're doing and why. But the drills themselves form habits that are very valuable if and when you eventually figure out how to put it together with other stuff. So you don't spar, but you do. There is contact and there's real throwing. I mean, you're throwing each other. And when I did Ki Aikido under the Tohei branch in Northern Virginia in the DC area, that was different than what it evolved to be later, because Tohei got really into the kind of the internal and the health aspects and less into the practical applications. Because there was something about the way Tohei did things. He was the kind of the head instructor before Ushiba's son took over. And then there was a split. But Tohei was a judo black belt before he got into Aikido. So he had a very intense, very powerful grappling style. But it was very much based in kind of relaxation and centering. And he had this way of being very powerful without using a lot of energy. And that was his whole thing. So have you heard of the unbendable arm?
I haven't heard of that. Can you?
So that's a
Ki
Aikido concept. That's something that he made a big deal about. So which he was always working on Ki. So he was always working on the ability to extend your energy and learn how to. It's a biomechanical thing as much as it's a relaxation and a mental thing. It's not a magical kind of thing, but from a metaphorical standpoint, they describe it this way: like you're basically, your Ki's going into your one point, which is your dantian below your navel, and then it comes into your body, and then it flows. You extend it. So if I stand in a position like this, and I'll tell somebody to come up to me and try to bend my arm, and if they take their, they could be big, strong, and they can take their hands and put it on my elbow, like right in the crook of my elbow, and then put my hand on their shoulder, and they try to bend my arm, they won't be able to. But I'm completely relaxed. So there's something about extending that energy and relaxing and having the right positioning, the biomechanical positioning, where you're incredibly strong and powerful. And the applications of that, once you learn that, are how you're able to be more relaxed. So when you're grappling or you're doing judo, you're doing different things with different people, and they try to muscle you, and they literally tell me, "Oh my God, you're bigger than me, you're heavier than me, and you're muscling me." And I'm like, "No, I'm not. I'm just relaxing." And so you're able to get strength and kind of leverage, and you learn how to do that. So there's some concepts that I learned from that. They actually, and some of those same concepts translate into kendo, where when you're sword fighting and somebody hits your sword, you extend that energy through your sword, and no one can move that sword. It's like, and I'm not an expert at the sword stuff. We worked a little bit on that when I was in Aikido in Northern Virginia, but he was really big on that aspect of it, and on the ability to, like, if you're staying under, if you're staying with one point and your weight is under your one point, so you kind of stand in a way that you're more rooted in the ground, and then your upper body is relaxed, so it's supple. So it's like if you ever try to grab a baby or like a toddler and they don't want to be picked up, and then they kind of like flop around, and it's like literally like you can't control them. Like it's like they have this power over you, right? It's kind of that concept where if someone tries to push you or tries to do something to you, if you're relaxed and you're centered, and then your upper body just goes with it, it's not easy for someone to take you and throw you or push you over. So that's what I learned from that kind of that perspective. And then when I came back up to the Boston area and I did Aikido, they didn't get into any of that. And they were more about going through the motions and then practicing and drilling. Long answer to your question as to whether they sparred.
No. And like, one of the things I noticed when I started doing the podcast was across styles and across sports, looking for trends. And this thing that you talk about, breathing techniques that focus on the navel, even though it sounds like voodoo and mumbo jumbo, right now the what is it? Mike McCastle, if anybody is interested, The Limits of Human Endurance with Mike McCastle on the Sterniest Life podcast with Stephen Kesting. This guy just broke, he's a former Navy SEAL, the list goes on, but he's made it his life goal to beat all these strength and endurance records. And his recent one was he immersed himself in ice for 2 hours and 40 minutes, beating the world record, beating John Wolf's record about being submerged in ice. And one of the things he started talking about is the same thing that you just mentioned, this what they call fire dragon breathing, where fire breathing, and it's a technique that comes from, I think, Tibetan monks. If I might be mistaken on the Tibetan part, but there's definitely something that goes back. It's called Tumo breathing and visualization techniques. And again, it's like this weird thing where you see it across different styles, this idea of breathing and visualization and using psychology to visualize. Like you said right now, you were saying about the baby, you relax like a baby, and then it makes it harder for you to pick up. And he was talking about how he'd visualize a small fire within his belly. And he had all these biometrics plugged up into him to make sure he would, because he essentially will die. Like any normal person submerged in ice will get hypothermia and die. And the way he hacked his body in 2 months to do this record was he learned these breathing techniques. He did some research, and then he plugged himself up. He had a bunch of medical staff on hand as he dipped himself in a big old thing of ice, and the started to turn to melt, and it was measuring his body temperature, and his body temperature would start to drop, and the oxygen levels in his blood would start to drop, and he'd start focusing more on visualizing this fire, he kept saying, in his stomach. Wow. And breathing into his stomach, and literally they can see the oxygen levels start rising and his temperature will start balancing out again. So there is something there. There's something physical there about the power of the connection between your mind and your body and breathing. There's definitely something there across styles. So like if Aikido is kind of tapping into that from a scientific perspective, it does make sense. I think it just gets tough when people start describing it from a non-scientific perspective. That's when you start losing people. Like when it does start sounding magical, the people that, I mean, it'll attract, right? There's some people that do love magic, right? There's people that like supernatural stuff, and that'll bring them in. But there's all those people that are completely turned off by it, and that's where they're that's where you lose some people too.
there was a technique in Ki Aikido that they were doing back in the early 90s where you would someone would come after you, you would evade, and they'd go by, and then you'd come back with a technique at the person's face, and there was no contact, and then the person would go and fall down. But it wasn't so much that the point was that there doesn't need to be any contact because of the expectation that you're going to get hit and the way you react. It wasn't like some of these, chi things where people are like doing stuff at you from a distance. And Ushiba was really good at that, where he had this technique. It's kind of like where someone tries to punch you or stab you with a sword or something. He had this way of moving at the last split second, so it just missed you. And then he would then take that momentum and use it against you. So there were some so he would basically kind of entice you to go after him, and then try to manipulate you to attack him. So there's an element of that to Aikido where a lot of people are like, they're right. People aren't just going to completely commit and attack you, especially if they have training in martial arts. They're not going to do things to an Aikido practitioner the way a Shotokan karate guy would, or the way a sword guy would, right? Because people know from their training that you can't just go after somebody, because then they're going to use that and throw you or do something. So, but there are ways that Aikido guys are pretty good at manipulating you into doing what they want you to do. So there is an element of that, I'm not an expert at that, but so there's some layers to it, right? I mean, but at the end of the day, like the other day in the podcast, I really enjoyed it. One of the guys said, Aikido is a finishing art. And the guy who founded Aikido was a security expert. He had some experience. He had sword expertise. There was a very martial aspect. Aikido is very pure, and it has this reputation of being kind of a gentleman's art, but there's a very martial aspect to the way he taught and what he did and how hard he was on his students. I mean, his students got beat up. It wasn't a joke. So, and they actually had to use what they did on the street, what they knew on the street, which is not what they wanted for a reputation. So there are elements to that you hear sometimes in stories. But the whole notion that it was a finishing art was really interesting, because there are people that are judo experts, people that are karate experts, people that have black belts in their styles, and then they come and now they learn weapons, they learn how to relax, they learn how to use footwork, he was really big on footwork, and he had some weapons forms where you kind of step offline, step out of the way, use people's momentum against them, and then there was some sword and some Joe types of forms.
What's a Joe?
A Joe, it's like I think it's slightly shorter and slightly harder than a bow. And there's a 32 step form that they teach, and then it can be translated to sword as well. So that it's really, if you look up some of the videos on YouTube, it's really, really interesting, especially if you look up the applications where they're actually using it on people. Ueshiba really taught some really cool stuff. And then he had same thing that my teacher did, where he taught certain black belts certain things. So there's certain people under Ueshiba that are really good at sword and that are really good at the Jo and really good at different weapons. And they all had their expertise, and then they all had, things that they would emphasize. But he would just teach different people, and then each one of them would kind of create their specialties around these areas that he would teach them. I lost you.
Oh no, I muted myself.
Oh, okay.
I think I found a picture of a Joe staff, so I can show everyone who's watching on YouTube real quick. So this is a Joe staff that I found online. It seems to be 50 inches, so it's a little smaller than your average bow staff, it looks like.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the kind of.
And I remember we would practice it in class. This was up in the Boston area. It was awesome because when you do Aikido, there's this tendency, and if you've done grappling or judo, you know how when you're grappling, if you let your arm come out, you're now vulnerable, right? If someone wants to take you, if someone wants to do an arm bar on you or take you down, or even the Kaju techniques that we use, right? But if you can stay here and you can keep that angle constant, right? You have incredible leverage, and then you use your hips, right? So if you have a Jo, and then you go to get somebody, and then someone grabs onto the Jo. So this is 50 inches, right? So there's a technique, and I don't remember exactly how you're holding it, but you're holding the Jo, and then someone grabs onto the Jo, and they're going to try to take it away from you. Well, if you know how to do what you're doing, and you know how to use your biomechanics, you can throw that person literally their entire body weight now that they're holding onto the Jo, and we would throw them, and then we would roll out of that, So it was really, it's so subtle, but not subtle, like the things you can do, just understanding the little things, And I think that's where when you're already a black belt in a martial art, and then you add those things in, now when you're doing one of the self-defense combinations that we do in Kaju, and then you tweak what you're doing a little bit and apply that. Now when you go throw somebody, you're like, wow, like it's easier, you know. That's what I like about it.
I think so. I think it's interesting when you talk about like the origins of the art did have sparring, did have more contact, and then as time went by, it became what it is now. And this is nothing new. I mean, this has happened to several martial arts throughout time as a society goes from being more violent to becoming more civilized. Their martial arts tend to start going towards less contact. But even in the past, this is a Japanese martial art we're talking about here. And if we go back even further to Miyamoto Musashi, in his book of the Five Rings would talk about, and I've mentioned this on the show before, in his book, and for those of you who don't know, Miyamoto Musashi was a samurai that was alive and wrote a book that was published, and you can still find it on Amazon. And he was alive during the period in Japan where the samurai were being disbanded, and they were kind of going into more of a no more shoguns, no more of that stuff. They're going more into a peaceful era where they wouldn't need samurai anymore, and people were kind of transitioning towards the end of his life where they weren't even allowed to have swords out in public anymore. So he wrote this book about martial arts, and one of the things he talked about in that book was the same thing, watching this era where all of their martial arts at the time were preparing them for war with swords and knives, and you had these people who were teaching martial arts who were now no longer really applying the martial part as he felt. So like he felt there was more contact, it was coming from war, they were preparing people for war. And now he was also noticing, just like nowadays, he's noticing these guys that would show up that claimed to be fighting in these wars that I was at that battle. I never saw that guy. Like, where'd this guy come from? Suddenly he's got this huge school, all these people, he's suddenly teaching Bushido. Right. And I've never saw this guy in my life. And, so it's kind of like the same, this argument that people have nowadays about modern combat, because at his time, he was coming from modern combat. And he was one of the people that in his time that was modern. Now it's ancient. But this little conversation that I have on this podcast and these arguments I see people having on YouTube, this is nothing new. Like people have been having this. That's not real. That would never work. That's been happening for a very long time.
Well, the problem I have, I'm going to say this, and I think this is really important to say. I have a problem with people that don't understand a technique. They see it once, and then they say, okay, we're going to test this technique. And then there's two people, they create a video, and they test the technique, and it doesn't work. And they go, see, it doesn't work. It sucks. I'm like, you have no idea how to actually do that technique, and you're proving it doesn't work. Just open your mind and learn and have an open mind, because sometimes maybe you just don't understand. Like there's a TikTok is like a weird addictive thing.
Not TikTok.
There's a guy on that, but he's a Taekwondo guy, and he's got MMA experience. He's a Taekwondo guy, but he's got MMA experience. And he's like, people say that these kicks don't work. And one of the kicks is like the kick from Karate Kid. And basically it's just a jump front kick, right? So he shows in actual MMA fights where these kicks work. And I'm like, and I made a comment. I'm like, that's the thing. People don't understand how to use a particular kick or a particular technique. And then they say, well, it doesn't work. And I'm like, well, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it doesn't work. It's the same thing in Kaju. Like all the stuff we learn, our instructors say it all the time. And it's true. Sometimes it works for me and doesn't work for someone else, or you don't like it, or you haven't figured out. Like my judo sensei, he's like, oh, that throw. He's like, I can't do that throw worth crap. It's like, but there's another black belt who does it really well, So at the end of the day, we're still here to learn, and some of the stuff actually works. So if you stick around and try it, eventually you create gold from some of these things. So, but I don't want to go too long, but there's something I think is relevant to what you're saying and relevant to what we're saying is it's a story that's a true story in my family. My great grandmother, she made this sauce, clam sauce. And whenever she made the clam sauce, my uncle Eddie would look at her, watch her, and he wanted to learn how to make this clam sauce. It was like his favorite dish, and it's his grandmother that made it. And she's from Sicily, and it was like so she would take this wet towel and put it over the top of the clam sauce and cook it. And so every time he would make this clam sauce, he'd make sure he had this wet towel. And then one time he was at my aunt's house, and she was making it, and she didn't have a wet towel over the pot. He freaked out. He's like, "What are you doing? You got to put the wet towel." And then he saw his grandmother the next time, and he's like, "Nana, why do you put the wet towel over the pan?" She's like, "Because I lost the pot cover." So there's a lot of stuff we do that we don't really know why we do what we do, and sometimes it has nothing to do with anything. So that's true also, so.
Yeah, no, I think, and again, like it really has to do with where and why are you doing what you're doing, and what's the application, and why are you doing it? Because I think a lot of people, they kind of forget that when you get into this, it really depends. Again, why are you doing it? For me, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and it's gotten to a point where I no longer care about techniques. I do techniques, but like I cringe when someone brings me in the side during open mat. They're like, "Can you show me how I should escape full mount? Show me how to escape full mount." And I look at the guy. I'm like, "You're a blue belt. You know how to escape full mount. Why do you want me to show you how to escape full mount? You already know how to do this. Like, why do you want me to explain this to you again?" He's like, "No, I want to do it the way you do it." And I'm like, I'm not going to show you something magically new, right? It's not like I'm going to have some new way to do it. I'm probably going to show you something you all have already seen. And I showed him one of the ways. I'm like, here's a variation that I like to do that I don't see very often. Like I do it quite a bit, but I don't see other people doing it. So here, try this out. Mm. And I was surprised when he's like, "Oh, I've never seen that before." And I'm like, "Okay, I guess." Like I don't I don't see my art as an accumulation of techniques. I see it as an accumulation of principles. So I don't try to collect techniques. I try to collect principles, and then other techniques break from that. Because then when I'm sparring, especially when I'm sparring and things are going, if I'm going hard with someone, I'm not really thinking I want to get them in A, B, C technique. I'm looking at what opportunity arises and what I'm going to do with that. So so with what you're talking about, like accumulating as much, not so much the techniques, but the principles behind it, the ideas behind it. Right. So when you talk about Aikido, like they're putting their hands up and they're doing last minute changes and moving out of the way last minute. When we talk about that, this is the same thing as in boxing. When you talked about like having your hands centered here and not having your hands out, they say that in different styles of boxing, always have your hands centered. So like, again, it's more about like concepts and principles. But before I keep dragging on, Mickey, I love the background. I really like, I'm digging the blue mermaid bear. That is awesome. Are you?
Hey, Anthony, nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you.
Don't let this fool you, bro. This is an improvised weapon. All right? It could work.
That statement alone, I think, defines Kajukenbo right there.
Everything is a weapon behind me, bro. Don't worry, I got it. No, I don't try to waste no more energy, bro. I can't go 2-minute rounds no more. 5-minute rounds, whatever. It's ridiculous. So what did I miss, guys? Sorry about the traffic.
No worries. So for those of you listening, we just got joined by Coach Mickey Lopez, coming out of D-Style Boxing Academy, also Kajukenbo instructor, coming out of Southern California. Where at?
Northern California.
Northern California. My bad. Northern California. And Anthony, you were mentioning you're in the Boston area, right?
Yes.
All right, cool. So this is coming from Boston. Well, we're pretty much right now. We just got done talking about Anthony's history with Kajukenbo, Kempo, Ed Parker Kempo, and then mixing it up with some Aikido. And we started talking about the history of martial arts a little bit. And now you're here with us So I guess we're going to start transitioning to part 2 of the podcast. So for those of you listening right now, thank you very much for listening to Anthony's martial arts journey. If you want to see our discussion about gross motor skills versus fine motor skills in martial arts, I do ask you to join us for part 2 of this podcast, which is going to be titled Gross Motor Skills versus Fine Motor Skills in Self-Defense and Fighting. All right, so thanks for catching Social Jello with Angelo. I'll see you in part 2 of this episode.